Hello again, and welcome to this week's recording of Relentless podcast. I am very excited to have you join me. I have a wonderful guest, one of Zambia's most brilliant minds with a phenomenal background and illustrious career in the finance, banking, and investment industry. My guest is none other than Dr. Jacob Lushinga. Doctor, how are you today?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Very, very good to connect with you. How's your family? How's everything?
Everything is all right. They're all good. Kids in school.
That's
Everybody is health-wise.
fantastic. Doc, I'm just, first of all, you have an impressive resume. Fantastic. I mean, it's one of the best with your career, having worked in the banking industry, finance, also taught and, studied up to PhD level, advisory roles with the governor, the president inclusive. It's just, it's incredible. And I think you're just a phenomenal resource, not only to Zambia, but the entire continent, really. So, and I think that this conversation will be very educative for me, but also for a lot of our listeners. And so we're going to dive into a lot of things with, the current energy crisis in Zambia and everything in between. So I think to begin with, why don't you just give us a little intro about yourself?
Well, thank you. I started out as a banker, really, having graduated with a first degree out of the University of Zambia. I graduated in economics and mathematical statistics. I joined then Zanaco as management trainee, we were called those days. It wasn't for long.
Mm-hmm.
I moved over to then Development Bank of Zambia as a research economist. And along the way, I was upgraded and I joined the bank's main operations as a project officer. It was at the DBZ that the University of Zambia recalled me as a staff development fellow, and at the same time offered me a scholarship to go to graduate school in America.
Illinois, right?
Yes. So I went to Southern Illinois University.
Very nice.
Carbondale. I did a Master of Science in monetary economics. After graduating, I worked for a year at the university and had to come back to Zambia because I was in a bond with the University of Zambia.
So you owed them time?
Yes.
Okay.
So I was a lecturer at the university for about a year before I was quote unquote poached by the central bank.
Okay.
The Bank of Zambia in their research department as a senior economist.
Very good.
I started working out there for a while.
Very good. So obviously you've risen across the board and worked your way to now. Tell me, what are you doing now?
Right now, I'm an executive director for a finance and investment company called Credence.
Credence
It's a private firm, mostly doing consultancy, microfinancing, and investment facilitation.
Right. So I think it's a good point to start from is that especially now with the current economic situation and everything happening in Zambia, your skills are most valuable and draw a phenomenal resource to Zambia, the economy and investments and those things. So maybe a good place to start is why don't you tell me a little bit about Zambia's current economic situation? Because I know right now there's an energy crisis. Obviously, there's a few other economic challenges. What's Zambia's current landscape right now?
Well, first of all, Zambia is a lovely country, the best in the Southern African
I agree with that.
Position of the African continent. It's a huge, geographically and physically huge country, spanning 750,000 square kilometers. We are going through what I might term a difficult period, mostly due to energy shortage, electricity in particular. We have had the budget for 2025 presented this year, and the budget admits clearly that Zambia is facing very harsh socioeconomic conditions. We have had a worsened food security, extended hours of load shedding, just cutting off electricity. We are unable to provide electricity for 24 hours. We have inadequate access to safe and clean water.
Yeah.
We have disease outbreak impending, in particular cholera at
And
this time
obviously,
of the year,
right,
with the
right.
difficult electricity situation we are having.
Quite right. And so, just
Yeah.
to back a little bit on that, is that Zambia is largely dependent on hydropower.
Hmm.
And because of the poor rainfall in the last year, in the previous rain season, there was not enough supply there's not enough electricity generated, and therefore the country is in a shortfall at the moment. And what's your perspective on that? And I think that what Zambia has to be one of the last countries really still totally reliant on hydropower. And I
Hmm.
think that probably brings in your expertise there. What's your comment as far as Zambia's efforts to diversify its electrical supply? Because I'm sure this is something that is not happening for the first time.
Yes, first of all, admittedly, Zambia almost entirely depends on hydroelectricity generation. Over 85% of Zambia's capacity, installed capacity, is for hydroelectricity, and the supply is as such. Slightly over 3,000 megawatts per month is what is required in Zambia right now.
Right.
And only 10% of that, 300 megawatts,
Wow.
is supplied otherwise through a coal thermal power plant that I worked for up until recently.
Right. And this is Mamba College, right?
Mamba Collieries, yes,
Okay.
supplies 300 megawatts of electricity. I would say 285 because Mamba itself uses about 23
Yeah.
megawatts per month. Other than that, there's a small high fuel oils plant in Dola on the Copper Belt, which generates right about slightly more than 4 megawatts per month, and a solar plant on the Copper Belt owned by the Copper Belt Energy Company recently came onto the grid. It also supplies roughly about 2%, 55 megawatts.
Right.
And so we can say we depend entirely on water,
Right.
hydroelectricity generation, which has failed for
Right.
this year. Failed because of the non-occurrence of rains.
Right.
Our water bodies are entirely dependent on rainfall, and there was a drought last year, I must say. We
Yeah.
expect normal rains this year, and hopefully that situation will come to pass, but it will take a little while,
Right.
earliest is April next year, if we have good waters. Until then, we are now depending on the 300 megawatts Amber collieries generated by coal, and efforts are now coming, frantically to put alternative sources of energy.
Yeah.
Solar is key amongst those
Right.
that is coming, but until now, the biggest generation from solar we have is the 55 on
55.
the Copper Belt. We have
Right.
a 5 megawatt small plant here in Lusaka
Yeah.
at the Mount Pepos Economic Zone.
Right.
But that's really for the consumption of the industrial park there and for the owners. So
Yeah.
yes, we depend on hydro by and large.
Right. I'm just thinking because even if you add all the possible sources that are available right now between the 300 in Mamba and then 55 and the 2%, that still doesn't even get to 50%, at least to where maybe the economy can be functional. And I think that the impact, especially of such a crisis, is the small scale business entrepreneurs and the young, and all these, the middle class of the country, really. How has this impacted the economy?
Very negatively, very harshly, I must say.
Yeah.
Zambia's employment levels are very, very low.
Right.
Very little formal sector employment. And so the mainstay of the ordinary person is small and medium enterprise,
Right.
Especially the small enterprises, small and micro, I must say. People you mentioned working in barbershops,
Yes.
hairdressers, welders, metal fabricators on the street, carpenters. All that workforce, which over 70% of the youth in Zambia are employed by this.
Yes.
And they've been literally declared redundant. They are self-employed, but
Yeah.
they cannot find jobs right now
Right.
because they're dependent on the main grid of electricity. They
Yes.
cannot afford diesel
Right.
generation from themselves.
That's
They
right.
cannot afford adequate solar panels that can, operate their machines. And
Right.
so they wait until you have the 3 hours of electricity, which is coming after midnight. And
Right.
so, yes, there is a lot of hardships. Like I said earlier, this has been admitted
Right.
by the budget and by implication by the government that the
Right.
socio-economic conditions have worsened in the country,
Right.
and everybody is going through a very
It
harsh time.
begs the question because I think that the problem, obviously, and I think that, I believe the government is doing its very best to mitigate this crisis. But it begs the question because you have to think about this could have been this obviously was projected that, and you obviously can't just be totally dependent on hydropower. I want to find out, as much as you know, how Zambia has been actively involved, especially with environmental conservation measures, because I think that's one of the biggest things when you're thinking about rainfall, is that even when I was growing up in Zambia, there was a lot of tree cutting and there was buildings going in places they shouldn't be going. So all of these things, I think, are ultimately what's affected and caused the shortfalls in rainfall. If we do just a little geography here, how environmentally friendly and alert is Zambia working in making sure that they protect the environment, number one, to predict a little bit more of the rainfall, which obviously then allows for power generation, but then also as a country, because the world globally is moving to an environmentally friendly sort of platforms. So how is Zambia positioning itself in those aspects? Do you think there's good measures being placed by the government to try and attend to these concerns?
Yes, there's an awareness. And currently, there is a dedicated ministry in the government it's called green economy
Hmm.
ministry, responsible primarily for awareness and sensitivity on the environment. But you see, that's not something that happens in a day.
Right, right.
Admittedly, I was serving as a board member on the country's biggest timber growing industry. It's called Zafico in Zambia. And
Right.
during my tenure, we realized that for 20 years, Zambia had not been growing trees, especially the trees that we use for timber pine. And there was a
Hmm.
shortage. And of
Right.
course, we made efforts to address that and planted millions of trees. But we found out painfully that the areas where most of the trees had been cut down, the rain pattern has changed. And you
Mm.
cannot grow trees in those areas anymore. Like you
All right.
cannot grow fast growing soft timber trees like pine in the southern part of the country. Impossible. Some parts of the Copper Belt where there was plenty of rain and a lot of trees, we found it difficult to grow. So we had to move up north
Right.
of the country, in Wakula, where we planted millions of trees in my 3 years at this institution. And so, yes, there is a realization that most of the trees were felled for timber. Some, unfortunately, have been cut down as fuel to make charcoal. And
Mm.
this is a
Right.
notorious, I'll call it, industry in the country that is ongoing
Right.
today. All this is because of lack of an alternative cheap fuel
Yeah.
solution, which is electricity. Over 75% of the country has no electricity, is not on the grid. As much as we are crying now, those of us who are privileged and on the line of rail and where there is a lot of electricity, as we are crying that we cannot receive it anymore due to shortage brought about by failure in water
Right.
from the hydro generated electricity. The majority, the bulk of the country is
Right.
not lit, does not have electricity. And so people depend on
Hmm.
charcoal. So they
Right.
cut down the trees, they make charcoal.
Yeah.
But that is literally robbing the country of its
Right.
ideally beautiful and wonderful tree cover.
Right. Really, it sounds like the problem is bigger, and I think it's going to need a lot of concerted efforts between the government and the private sector. But then also, I think that it's from an investment standpoint, it really presents an opportunity to really tap into the industry. How economically friendly is and empowering is the Zambian economy right now for local investors to venture into the energy industry? But then also, how is Zambia positioned as far as attracting foreign investment in the energy industry?
First of all, we can start with the Zambia as an ideal destination for investment. How ideal, how friendly is the country? I'll say it's one of the best in the Southern African region. It's a very peaceful country. We've never had any war, any civil war since we got independence. There is no threat of such an occurrence of war.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we have a very vibrant and very active political environment spurred by democratic um, uh, dispensation, I must say. And so everybody's free to form their own party. Everybody's free to contest for elections in whatever capacity they have. That in itself, for me, is a healthy environment rather than anything else, because then you realize that people will compete and strive, and those that are in office will strive to work harder to ensure, first of all, the country's economic conditions are in good place, and that the people of Zambia are served to the best of their abilities. We have laws and rules and regulations that protect investment in the country, foreign direct investment.
Right.
And so there is no chaos, there is no fear that
Right.
as a business person, as an investor, one day you wake up and find your business has been taken over by the government. No, that does not happen. That has never happened in a long time since we reverted to multi-party democracy. And we're entrenching that. We're getting stronger actively the political environment. And so I would say that is one of the foundations, the cornerstones of good investment climate in the country. We have a very good weather pattern. You can dress in exactly t-shirt in the country for throughout the year, I could say, and there are no extremes of weather. There's no extremely cold temperatures. There's no extremely hot temperatures. So that makes it a very good environment for agricultural activity in the country as well as manufacturing. We have a lovely game reserve in the country, a lot of fauna, and therefore forms the backbone of a good investment climate for tourism and hospitality industry. Zambia is predominantly a mining country, copper mining, and the bulk of that is up north in the copper belt with the little, streams in Lusaka and slightly to the west in Mumbai. That in itself is a huge investment opportunity and forms a highly profitable mining investment in the country.
Right. And there's some friendly tax incentives, I understand, especially in Zambia right now, right?
A lot of tax incentives, especially in the agriculture sector. It has spilled over now to the energy sector, energy being literally a subsector. But, with the hype of the need for electricity and other forms of energy generation and provision, it has come out quickly as a vital, sector on its own. Yes, so there are the crisis that we've gone through, the problem that we are encountering now has in itself become a huge opportunity for investment in this sector.
Right.
Hitherto, we thought only government could invest in hydroelectricity generation. Obviously, because of the size of the value of investment, it's very capital intensive and it needs a lot of money. But that is an opportunity for people to work together, to pool resources together, to combine efforts in terms of skills and or financial capital to go into this sector. And use of other sources of energy, alternative sources of energy. I mentioned solar. I've never seen a wind generation plant in Zambia.
How much do these things cost? I'm just wondering, like for turbines and things like that. I wonder how much of an investment that would need to put those things up. Do you have any idea on those?
It depends the type of investment you want to make and this subsector in the energy sector that you want to go into. But by and large, it's a very highly capital intensive sector, very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Core generation, for instance, you need no less than $1 million per megawatt. So 1,000 megawatt worth of electricity generation for thermal power plant will need no less than $1 billion. Okay, so you're saying 100 megawatts needs $100 million.
Okay, yeah. So it's like a $3 billion investment, really, to sustain Zambia's energy need.
Currently, yes, but the hydro generation plants were done a long time ago. They're very old, but still effective, still efficient. So you might want to add that prior investment in that sector has been minimal or modest. The demand for electricity, like I said, only a portion of the country is power, is what is spurring the cost of investment in this sector. But also, we must admit that the profitability in this sector is well worth it, and making these projects very bankable in the energy sector. We have other sectors prioritized because of the endowment of resources within this sector. Let me mention mining that we talked about, agriculture, manufacturing, tourism,
is another one.
Hospitality. Now, added to those has come for the banking and financial sector, as well as the energy sector, which we've already discussed. So you find that there's an array of investment opportunities in these sectors.
One of the industries that I have personally with a few partners we've explored and looked into is the microfinance industry. And I know that one of the biggest challenges experienced in Zambians, local Zambians right now, is access to capital with the high interest rates and things like that. And I know there's been efforts by the government to bring in CDF, which is Community Development Funds, and efforts to try and support cooperatives within Zambia. How much do you think these are effective programs, and do you think that these are platforms that can allow for a partnership among us local Zambians to tackle some of Zambia's, economic challenges?
Oh, yes. You see, hitherto there have been controls in whole sectors of the Zambian economy prior to the multi-party era. Now, there came financial sector reforms in the early 90s. However, despite these I must call them deep financial sector reforms undertaken in the early 90s, the expected benefits have been very slow, and sometimes you might say they have not come. And that is because there has been very little new investment in the sector. This has really formed huge investment opportunities in the sector. To date, credit to the private sector by commercial banks is very low. I can say it was 8% in 2005. To date, it hasn't grown beyond 20%. I can safely say 20% of adults in Zambia only have banking or bank accounts. You're talking about 80% of the country unbanked.
Okay. Sorry to cut you short. Has the mobile money business been a big player in this? Is there any regulation around things like mobile money? Because even when I have to send money, for instance, to Zambia, I use mobile money, and it was Western Union before, which was costing so much, and you had to go to a call center and things like that. But it's a lot more seamless now, just using a mobile app, and I'm able to send money. Is there any regulation on the government's end to track money being transacted into Zambia? And is there, because I wouldn't mind paying $1 on top of the money that I'm paying, and this would mean revenue for the country. Are there any measures around things like this? Because I think the middleman is the only person making the money, and really all these transactions have not benefit directly to the Zambian economy besides the people and the individuals getting the money.
Yes, mobile money services have come in handy and have changed the landscape of financial services in the country. They have their limit, however. I was talking about adults forming only 3%. Mobile money have revolutionized this phenomenon. Almost everybody who can handle a smartphone has an account of sorts in terms of money transfer service, micro money borrowing, but this is minute and really inconsequential to economic activity. But you can keep money, in these accounts. And so it has really have had a very big impact in the financial services sector. But we are talking about entrepreneurial financial facilities, loans, business loans.
Yeah, capital,
Things that you can use to create employment. Now, I need to backtrack a little bit and add quickly that mobile money facilities have employed a huge number of unemployed youth. You find every youth that cannot get a job, is on the road trying to provide money transfer services. This is slowly going down because now you can use your bank accounts
the same way you can use
to send and receive money electronically on a mobile phone.
Right.
And what does that tell us? Only 20% of the country, its adults, have bank accounts. So you still get to a depth of financial services and get back to mobile money services. And so they are an influential and highly impactful factor. Ask, why has the liberalization of the financial sector in Zambia not delivered the benefits that we expected? You need to go back on that drawing board and then realize that there's still, or has been from the beginning, inadequate sequencing of the liberalization reforms. They were done in the urban areas, but provision of services outside the line of rail. By the way, Zambia is kind of cut in two, with a line of rail coming up from the north down to Livingstone. And along this area is where the copper belt is on the north, and therefore highly urbanized, and all the modern financial services and other infrastructure, including physical infrastructure, lies along. So we failed to diversify or provide these reforms to ensure entrenchment of the financial sector infrastructure and services away from this area. And secondly, there's been insufficient economic growth in the country.
Right. Do you
currently 2.3%? Say that again.
Do you think it's more of a policy issue, or is it more of an implementation issue? Because I think you can look at it from both sides, right? Do you think there's enough regulation from the side of the government to sensitize the people about the operations and the benefits of all of this? Is because I'm not very conversant with how the Zambian system works, but I would imagine that you need to build some form of trust with the banking system. So, for instance, an entrepreneur running a mobile money business needed to ultimately secure a larger loan which operates 3 times that amount, that number. They would have needed to build a form of relationship with the bank and to build that trust relationship. But in the absence of them being able to have that relationship with the bank really doesn't have any history on them. Do you think there's been enough sensitization and coordination between the banks, the people, and the government policy?
Well, first of all, I would say both, yeah. But I mean, the backbone, the foundation is that there's got to be money for somebody to seek a financial service. Now, like I said, there is insufficient economic growth, widespread poverty, and few jobs in the formal economy. We highlighted that. We talked about the informal entrepreneurial sector affected negatively by shortage of electricity. That has also affected the growth of the financial sector. You've got to have a job to have a bank account.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
You have to have money to want to invest and grow a business, to seek a loan, to seek any financial service. But if the country is predominantly of low economic growth, widespread poverty, and unemployment, how do you access a financial service? Right. Thirdly, within the financial sector itself, there's a lot of crowding out of bank funds to finance government activity. The traditional crowding out effect in economics has worked and is entrenched in Zambia. Government borrows from the banking system, and there's very little or nothing left for the private sector to borrow. Secondly, the banking and financial sector itself has no incentive to appraise projects correctly and sufficiently to want to give loans to the private sector because they can lend. They just buy treasury bills and treasury bonds and lend to the
Right.
government in the process, and they go to sleep. They go on
Mm-hmm.
holiday. They know they're going to earn money. At the end
Right.
of the day, they don't need to follow up a loan appraisal.
Right.
But that is connected to economic activity and therefore economic growth
Yeah.
negatively. That has deterred growth and activity in the
Right.
financial sector. There's also the issue, fourthly, there's the issue of deficiencies in the basic infrastructure of financial sector development. Yes, we have
Mm-hmm.
highlighted now that the mobile phone companies have come on board and they are servicing this, very, very well. But
Yes.
the basic infrastructure, the backbone of any economic activity, the way you see bad roads and poor electricity connections physically in the country is the way the internet and other, technological advancement are within the
Mm-hmm.
country. And this needs to be addressed for you to have a
Right.
vibrant financial
Right.
sector and deep economic activity.
Right. One of my biggest concerns, especially for an economy like Zambia, because like Zambia went through a change of government very recently, I think 3 years ago, and there's an election coming up. There seems to be a misalignment or miscommunication between the government and the people, that between the expectation of what the government, the political party, whichever one wants to become president, take over power, they seem to have an ally of promises and things like that, seemingly relate, especially from a novice's point of view. They'll be interpreted as being, the best thing that could happen to Zambia, without understanding the nuances of what it takes to move a country like Zambia from, for instance, a C grade on the economic platform globally to a B grade, for instance, because right now Zambia's balance sheets are not really looking good in the eyes of the big power players like the IMF and things like that. And basically, the economy is not making enough money to sustain itself, and a lot of it is going to debt restructuring and paying off all these loans and all kinds of things like that. How is that happening? And what's your best advice from an expert point of view? There's a complete misunderstanding and translation between economic policies at play and the translation to the end user, which is the people. How is that happening? And it seemingly is happening continuously.
Yeah, admittedly, there is an interconnection between economic policy implementation. It's
Hmm.
one thing to formulate economic policy, but its implementation is another.
Right.
So there is an interconnection between economic policy implementation and political policy and or political activity. Policy is formulated by experts, and there are a lot in the country, and we seek a lot of help and advice from the outside the country,
Hmm.
but its implementation is highly affected by politics,
Right.
and so it becomes difficult at some point to try and separate the two. But some of us want to, as much as possible, keep to the professional line and advise appropriately without being misunderstood, as
Right.
hard as that is,
Yes.
of being politically inclined or another. We spend our lives in, studying and practicing economics. And so that's the best that we know, and that's the best that we can do. So we want to keep to that lane and
Right.
advise whoever,
Hmm.
takes up the mantle
Right.
of politics. But you're right. It's difficult.
Hmm.
It has to have some kind of relationship and
Right.
understanding of what a technical advice is, what it will do, and how it will translate into better economic uh, uh, environment in the country. I
Right.
mentioned that the country still lags behind in infrastructure development and is
I did a little
widespread.
study recently. Yeah, I did a little study recently about Zambia's current economic landscape. And I think one of the biggest things happening for Zambia right now is the availability of manpower. The economy right now, Zambia's population is really dominated by the youth, which is, there's a lot of strong young men and women able to do a lot of these things. And I think it's really something that must attract deliberate efforts to empower them, because Zambia's average age, I think, is in the 40s at the very best, if I remember correctly. What do you think is the immediate impact of the fact that there's so many young men and women graduating college who cannot find work and they've got the skill set? And how can what do you think would be a quick solution to that crisis right now? Because we have the manpower, we have the young men and women professionals that have been rightfully educated, but the government can only be the employer. So obviously we have to depend on the private sector, but the private sector hasn't had enough empowerment. What's your best suggestion on how all of this can be mitigated really by efforts of investment?
Well, the immediate impact of an unemployed youth is frustration.
Right.
You've been in school most of all your life.
Mm-hmm.
You've been studying college level, you get a university degree, and you get out and you're on the street.
Right.
There's nothing as frustrating, as hurting as that. You don't have a
Right.
job.
Mm-hmm.
But also, that is just the beginning. It has a lot of socioeconomic impact on the rest of the country. The widespread poverty I'm talking about starts from there.
Mm-hmm.
You're a youth, 3-4 years down the line, you want to look for something to do.
Right.
Not everybody finds something just to make ends meet.
Right.
And the result is turning to crime
Mm-hmm.
and other vices, of a bad economic environment. Because somebody
Right.
has to have basic needs, shelter, food,
Right.
and
Yes.
clothing. You cannot have that if you don't have a job. But you
Right.
see, this is a spiral. And this is what leads to the poverty cycle. It's a trap, because the bulk of the country is poor. The bulk of the country is not doing anything productive. Therefore, they're not generating any income.
Right.
They aim for that to be their own personal income, but that's what aggregates into national income, meaning
Right.
the whole country has a lower income. Because you have a lower income, you do not have enough resources to generate higher economic activity. You cannot grow the
Right.
economy. Therefore, if you don't grow the economy, there'll be no jobs.
Right.
Okay. Jobs arise out of economic activity,
Yes.
out of people working in industry, be it mining, manufacturing, agriculture, tourism and hospitality, energy sector, the financial and banking sector.
Right.
They cannot grow if these youths are not joining, those sectors and generating some form of income.
Yeah.
So it's a vicious circle. It comes right back at you, and you therefore, as a government, you have very little revenue generation through tax.
Right.
And it's apparent now. The government is failing to pay debt. Why? Because it has not enough money. Why has it not enough money?
Right.
Okay, it's the government. Because its tax handles are very little. The tax
Very limited.
is very narrow.
What's the percentage of the
enough
taxing
money.
in Zambia? Is it 20% of the workforce?
Say that again?
What's the workforce percentage in Zambia currently?
Less than 30% of the population, employable population, are in formal employment. And the bulk of that, of the little, 20+%, are employed by the government. Now, that tells you something.
Right.
Okay. Any country, any economy that has the majority of the employees working for the public sector is doing very badly.
Right.
Each time people want jobs in the country, each time all of us clamor for a position in the government, that tells you the economy of that particular country is doing very badly. Okay?
Right.
Immediately the private sector starts employing, then they know there's vibrancy there. There is investment. People are manufacturing things. People are involved in agricultural activity. People are mining as a private sector industry. Then people will not be attracted to government jobs. Because the private sector, by nature, should be more attractive, should pay more.
Absolutely. It pays more and there's better incentive.
Two things happen here, two negative things. First of all, there are no jobs at all in the private sector. Second, the government is paying better than the private sector. There's something wrong, right? Where does government get its money from? It's a tax. That's the
Right.
main revenue of the government.
So the very
How
few
can he
majority
pay
in the
more than the people who
right,
are giving it money?
right, right,
We have a disconnect there. We need to address that. And like I
right.
said earlier, policy and this implementation needs to be looked at carefully. And we have
On that
a
same
system.
vein, then, would you speak more to Zambia's current situation as far as tackling corruption? Because I think one of the biggest concerns in the present government, in the previous government, and also from a global perspective between the people that have supported Zambia is the fact that there's very little financial accountability. Do you think that there's a move towards tackling that? Because I think just out of interest, I've been looking at reports of, for instance, all the transactions, illicit transactions going on between Zambia and all of these places. There's so much money going under the rugs. And I think that one of the things is that, especially, I mean, if you bring it down to the basic economic management, right? If you have an individual that's heavily in debt, and there's seemingly no solution for them to get above the water, is that you have to look at the expenditure, their wasted expenditure. How much money are you spending on, groceries, for instance? Is this maybe time to tighten the budget? So from now, that perspective, and if you look at the situation in Zambia, how sensitive and how sensitized and positioned really is Zambia in tackling some of these concerns in the global community that corruption is still pretty high and there's a lot of illicit financial transactions going on?
Well, I'd rather speak less of corruption and the way it's being displayed. But I
Right,
would want to admit that it's an important aspect of any economic activity. I would
right,
speak frankly of corruption and say it's a leakage to
right,
economic activity, in particular public revenue. It's a disease, it's a cancer that needs to be addressed fairly and squarely.
right,
And from an economic point of view, I would speak of corruption as that undesirable
right,
phenomenon that
mhm,
needs to be rid of.
right,
Fortunately, actively political environment will have different interpretations of that
right,
and how they address it and who they address it to. So I'd
mhm,
rather keep it on the technical aspect that it's not to be tolerated. It's
right,
not to be, treated with kid gloves.
right,
It's a leakage of an income activity that
right,
will always erode economic growth in any
right,
setting, in any form, in any part of the world.
right,
And it has to be addressed fairly and squarely
right.
if you want to get rid of it.
I like that answer because I think that when I look at, for instance, the cost implication of setting up a business in Zambia, in the few things that we've been able to do, it's these are some of the legitimate concerns that really I personally have in my small capacity as a minority, like a minimal shareholder and investor in Zambia. But I can imagine this is a big concern at a global level, especially if I want to bring so many millions and millions of dollars into the country. And speaking on that, then I want to also just get your comments as far as the workforce in Zambia. How much regulation is there as far as economic empowerment? Because I think one of the things that allows for things like corruption to really happen in societies and communities like this is that people basically are not making enough money, and people, which is not an excuse, but there's really people are not making ends meet, and therefore this is allowing for a lot of these things that should not be going on in transactions, in procurement, in different sectors. Does the government understand this, and do you think the nation as a country is positioned to move away from this from an accountability standpoint where people can make money and be paid as they deserve and therefore deter people from basically getting into these vices?
First of all, there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, we can't run away from the fact that there are low incomes,
Hmm.
and wherever there are low incomes, there's an effort by people to protect themselves. A
Hmm.
human being is inherently selfish.
Right, right,
They would want to survive by any means. But like I said, I want to address the infrastructure and the cause of that. There can never be corruption if the system is working. It's that
right,
simple. However much people are starving, and not making enough money. They cannot resolve to corruption if there is a faceless, inhuman system that addresses the people equally as a whole. Now, immediately some people have privileges of accessing power to bully other people, to be the ones in front of a queue every time, you're buying anything, every time you're lining up for a job, every time, you're getting on a bus. Some privileged people who have power they can wield
it's
over
imbalance. It's an
others.
economic imbalance.
Then you have a breakdown. Okay, that in itself is corruption.
Right.
Corruption comes out of greed, oftentimes more than need. However much you're starving, you'd rather have two jobs than steal from your employer, than steal at your
especially
job.
with the implications involved,
Which is what corruption is, it's stealing.
Right.
Okay. So let's put in place systems that do not discriminate. Let's put in place systems that awards people for working hard.
Right. I agree with that.
You will be halfway there.
Yes.
And then you can start addressing the greedy people who will always be there, but who can be controlled and punished.
And punished,
if they refuse to follow the laid down rules and regulations. So I won't get too much excited about one name or two names being brought up as corrupt, because I know there's a lot more. And I know it's because of exactly the privileges they were given, the power that they were given in the public system that made them do what they did. There'll always be freeloaders in a society, in a community. But if you cap that with a system that awards hard work rather than some privileges of belonging to a certain group of people, be it color or tribe, or political organization, then you always have, corruption.
I really like that, which is why I really appreciate your insight, is that as you discuss this, you really go into the root of the problem and not just discussing particular situations, because in the limelight, there's been so many particular figures and highlights of people and individuals. But I think that what I really like about your answer is that it's really, you're suggesting, directing, going back to the actual root cause of these things, which is in the system and fixing the system. And it's very, very educative. I want to move on to the education sector, because we've discussed a lot of the problems in Zambia and some solutions, but the opportunity for Zambia and investment is massive. Obviously, we've discussed the energy sector, we've discussed some of the hospitality, but really Zambia's positioning right now is that the investment potential is really in every single field. And I know in our previous conversation, we've discussed about the shortage of housing and things like that, especially in the capital like Lusaka. As far as diversification of Zambia's economy, what do you think are the 5 biggest investment potential avenues currently?
Mining. In particular, copper mining still has a lot of investment opportunities. Needless to say, there are some non-traditional mining opportunities in manganese, precious and semi-precious stones. Titanium in Zambia is coming up, other non-traditional metals, but copper still remains the mainstay of the country, and arguably the biggest foreign exchange earner today, despite the issues that are going on in the copper mining industry. Needless to say, copper mining itself demands a lot of foreign exchange, so they use a lot of what that at least they make. Agriculture and agro-processing is another sector with a lot of investment opportunity. Zambia, like I said, it has a span of 752 plus, thousand square kilometers. Most of the country's land is arable, and agricultural activities are still a viable and potential investment opportunity. Manufacturing, we make very little or nothing in Zambia, and hence the pressure on the foreign exchange. The little that we make, we spend it because most of the things that we need are imported. And our balance of payment, is always negative, because our balance of trade, by the way, not the balance of payment.
What are some of the immediate manufacturing investment potentials in your view?
It's the things that we already produce in the country. Okay.
Right.
The resource from mining and agriculture as primary products to feed into the manufacturing industry. I mean, we have a comparative advantage on minerals, in particular copper. We have a comparative advantage on agricultural outputs, maize, soybean, wheat, and I'm mentioning the big crops, but not to forget sunflower and others, horticultural products. We can turn those as the main resource, as the primary inputs into the manufacturing, industry. I know people would like us to mention vehicles and other sophisticated
Electrical
machinery
vehicles with
for us to
right?
produce.
Yeah.
Do you have the capacity? Do you have the advantage of resources? That's what
and the technology,
makes a manufacturing base. And so I'll still stay with manufacturing. Fourthly, it's the tourism and hospitality industry. For the same reasons I mentioned above, availability of the main primary input into the tourism and hospitality industry. Zambia hosts one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Victoria Falls. Come on in and see that. And we should make now a service industry around that makes people comfortable and happy when they come. We can make money out of that. We are privileged with, I think, Africa's biggest national park, the Kafue National Park. Not the most populated, but the biggest. Okay.
Right. And it's all natural.
Yes, and it's all natural. It's all given. It's all a comparative and absolute advantage.
Do you think then that Zambia has done enough to connect to the global market from a digital standpoint? Because I think, as you know, when I listen to you, there's a lot of excitement out of me, but then also I'm thinking about the common average Zambian. How much do they know about what's happening digitally from on a global standpoint? For instance, like if you think of like connecting Zambia to the African grid, for instance, are there young Zambians right now with full knowledge of products that are needed in Egypt, needed in Nigeria? Because if you look at some of these countries that have thrived, or at least are doing better than Zambia at the moment, countries like Kenya, is that there's been a very deliberate effort by themselves as entrepreneurs, but also the government to support them to digitally connect with the global market. And I don't think that industry has really been maximized to its potential by local Zambians. What do you think is really the limiting factor to those things?
We need to advertise it more. We need to market, ourselves. We need to attract investments in this sector so that everybody, first of all, the people that live in Zambia are aware of the potential of what they're sitting on. Secondly, the market, the world out there knows and wants to come, to Zambia as investors or tourists and have a big share of what we are able to offer.
Right. Okay, I want to move away to now, some final topics. One of the biggest topics, really, at a global stage, is social impact. And I think that over the years, and this has been a big subject in the global market industry, is that debt has basically done more harm to countries like Zambia than it has really helped. What are your suggestions as far as especially from an end user with as much borrowing as Zambia done, and how has that translated to actual development and improvement of the country? And what efforts do you think should be applied to move away from reliance on debt? What's your views on that?
Reliance on debt publicly, issued debt that has a lot to do with the earning capacity of the government, the income, the revenue that government generates. Remember, we spoke of a negative balance of trade. Over the years, we have to balance our payments, meaning we have to have a budget that pays for the expenditures that the government is making. And therefore, we resort to borrowing, both domestically and publicly. The long-term solution to that is to expand your revenue base, to expand through the tax base as one of them. How do you expand that? It's the things we've been talking about: creation of employment through attracting investment into the country, expanding the 4 basic sectors that I talked about: mining, agriculture, manufacturing, tourism, and hospitality. When there are jobs there, government earns income through taxation. When government income is higher, government is able to pay its debt. One, but more importantly, government borrows less because it has its own revenue. And so that ties in with the eventual growth of the economy. You've got to expand the economy for you to have a wider tax base, to have a higher revenue for the government, and therefore a higher income. It solves the problem in the long run. In the short run, obviously, we've resorted to balance our payments by borrowing short-term from International Monetary Fund. That's a 1 year to 3 years solution that is short-term and that is temporary, but also very expensive. The rates that you pay there will be higher and illusionary. You think you're solving the problem. You're not. You're creating a new problem. Because in the long run, you need to expand your earning capacity. And that's what will solve that problem.
Right. So also then, on that same vein, I am thinking back to my time in Zambia, and there's been some really good investments and investors in Zambia, but also there's been questionable investment as far as the quality of investment and the quality of employment that's being offered by the investors in Zambia. How can government regulate this sector as far as, for instance, you have maybe an investor coming into mining, for instance, but therefore they don't really need any actual skills. They need like very cheap labor, and everything is either automated or they have unregulated numbers of expatriate employees that they're bringing into the country. Again, if you look at it from a broader perspective, therefore, there's not really sufficient benefits to the local Zambian. How much regulation can government place on such sectors, for instance, as far as making sure that, either say 80% of all workforce will be locally sourced, and there will be regulation in terms of how much expatriate employment they can provide and things like that. Do you think there's enough regulation in that sector?
Now, that's what we talked about earlier, the formulation and implementation, for you to have a regulatory framework that works. On paper, we do have the policy that says you cannot employ a foreigner and or an expatriate if that resource, if that skill is available in Zambia.
It's available, right? Because like countries like the UK and America,
you have to prove that you cannot find it in the country.
Right.
We have it on paper. It is policy that when you come and set up a new business that needs new skills and expertise in the country, you will need to start training the locals in that particular skill so that eventually they can take over. And this was working very well up until we started liberalizing this country.
Right.
Nothing wrong with liberalization. It's the guidelines that you talked about. It's a regulatory framework that can be enforced, that can be implemented to ensure that we have quality skills coming into the country. One, two, that we are passing on these skills to the Zambian. How else are our boys and girls, the youth that is on the street, going to have jobs if they're not learning?
Right.
Going to school is one thing, as we have all found out.
Yes.
But having the requisite skill to produce something, to mine something, to have that proper skill in the hospitality industry is something else. You need to be on the job. You need to train on the job. You need to practice, you need to be trained on the job for you to pick up that skill and be a useful worker. Okay. So that's one way of creating employment. That's one way of passing value, technical know-how to Zambians. But that's one way of returning the useful revenue within the country. That's one way of growing the economy.
Right. I was putting a list together for me, just for my own knowledge, is that really there's four areas I think that we're discovering here. Is that Zambia's investment potential is massive, phenomenal in every industry. If you think about the health sector, the hospitality industry, energy sector, mining, agriculture, incredible investment opportunities over there. But then also added to that is that there's a very readily available workforce in Zambia willing and able to do the work. And then there's a supportive government that is willing and very inviting to foreign and direct investment into Zambia. And I think that maybe some of the issues that are lacking is the sensitization and the communication between around regulation and all of these things. Would you agree those are some of the biggest areas of interest?
Yes, I would agree. But I keep getting back to implementation, enforcement, of these efforts and measures. That
Yeah, right. Very interesting. Okay, finally, I want to hear any comments that you have, and if you were actually before finally, if you would sit between somebody that is got the capital to invest in Zambia, and obviously Zambia, you've presented Zambia as a prime investment location, and there's obviously good tax incentives and things like that. What would you be adding comments on that, especially around just Zambia's positioning for investments?
obviously, depending on the amount of capital, there is a huge investment opportunity in the mining sector. But that goes with what would be the fabric of all industries in Zambia, the energy sector. And the investment opportunities are abound in the generation part of the energy sector, but as well as transmission. Most of the energy does not go into some parts of the country because there is no infrastructure. And so there is a lot of opportunities there for laying out the infrastructure, the transmission lines to the rest of the country. Investment opportunities are bound in the banking and financial sector. There's not a single local bank in Zambia today that is active. And so there's a lot of incentives in that area. Government demands, the regulatory part of the government, the central bank demands less capital, minimum capital investment if a bank is owned on the majority by the Zambian. So a foreign investor would easily come in and partner with the Zambian and quickly establish a bank. Investment opportunities abound in the tourism and hospitality industry. That stretches out to real estate development. We spoke about that briefly. Along the line of rail, there is a shortage of formal accommodation, formal housing. There's a deficit currently of in excess of 2 million dwellings, 2 million houses in the country. And that's because we are not expanding in that sector at the rate that the demand is. And investment opportunities are bound there. In manufacturing itself, we make very little or nothing, including packaging, for instance, in Zambia. Agro-processing, feed for animals, livestock, simply that, food for people. Investment opportunities are bound there, and it's a relatively low-cost sector, starting out businesses in there.
Right. Away from investment then, and I think this is that I would like to explore with yourself, maybe outside of this call, is that Zambia's positioning, there's a very competitive advantage here, especially for local Zambians, to maybe put up, especially the ones with the financial capacity, to put up a consortium and maybe tackle some of these areas, like, a collective of Zambian entrepreneurs or business minds with the financial backing to really come together and maybe tackle some of these industries. And I think that there's a lot of potential there.
Oh, yes, that can come in form of an investment bank, for instance.
Right.
Finance and investment companies. So you have a formal specialized financial institution that will then pick up the cream of opportunities in all these areas we've been talking about. And you can have influence in which sector, therefore, you want to invest or you want to grow. That is one neat way of organizing ourselves as Zambians. Zambians that are critical to what is happening in our economy, but also who have the desire and the willingness to do something about this. It's time people got to get on a private capacity without any politics attached to them. But really seeking out profit and in the process helping our country's economy.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you. And I think that that's really something that's very feasible. minimal discussion. Doctor, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. This has been very enlightening, obviously, and fantastic. Any final comments?
It's been a pleasant discussion, and thank you very much. Final comments: come out in Zambia and invest. We have a lovely country, warm and friendly atmosphere from the people, from the weather, from the terrain, and untapped virgin land of Zambia. We have a lot to do. Come on in and have fun.
Absolutely, Doctor. Thank you so much, and I couldn't thank you enough for joining me.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Take care.